I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to Mary Reynolds. Mary is a garden designer and she took the horticultural world by storm in 2002 when she did her Celtic Sanctuary Garden at the Chelsea Flower Show. And she's gone on to do a lot of design work, and now she's starting on a new project which is called We Are The Ark. And the website's in the show notes, and I do recommend that you check it out because basically it is her kind of addressing the fact that the work that she was doing early on in her career wasn't satisfying her, it wasn't working for her, and it wasn't really fitting in with her beliefs. So what I found interesting about Mary is that the pattern of my career is a bit like Mary's, in as much as there's one light bulb moment after another. And I've realised that even when I'm creating wild gardens, they're still a poor man's copy of nature. And there is that question that's occurred to me before, which is, should we even be gardening at all? And I totally agree with Mary's idea that we should leave some land alone. And I have spoken about that in previous episodes. And my answer to this question for some time has been that we shouldn't look to cultivate every last inch of our gardens. It's okay to cultivate areas, but we don't have to do it with every part. I mean, what's wrong with having the area nearest to the house full of flowers and leaving the end of the garden to go wild? Not only is this good for nature, but it makes our lives so much cheaper and easier. And I don't understand why we're not jumping at the chance to do this, really. And I think it comes from a little bit of fear and also, as Mary says in the episode, maybe a little bit of shame that we're not being good gardeners, we're not doing a good job. And as I've said before, it doesn't just apply in small gardens. It applies even if you've got a balcony. If a plant appears in the crack in the brickwork or in the joint between the wall and the floor, we've got the choice to just leave it alone. And as Dave Goulson recently said, a bee only flies with 40 minutes worth of fuel. So we need to be filling in the gaps in our landscape. So there is a network of fuel sources, nectar and pollen sources, water sources, resting spaces, shelter like Kate Bradbury spoke about in her episode. So that is a really, really important point. And I also was listening to a podcast interview with Mary where she spoke about magic in gardens. And I asked her about that because I don't think we should shy away from it. And you can call it what you want, really, but she does talk about it in her book. And it's really easy to dismiss this kind of thinking. But it does bubble away under the surface of horticulture in many, many ways, from biodynamic growing to lunar planting. As I say, doesn't matter what you call it, but it is something that I think a lot of us feel in one way or another. So I did want to explore that with her. And I think the other important thing about Mary is that she shows it's okay to adapt and change your career as you learn and as you grow personally. And if you switch stream as you go along in your career or any other part of your life, you're not being flaky or not applying yourself or any of the other charges that people might level at you. You're being adaptable and you're learning from your experiences and plotting your course according to every new piece of information that you take on board, as Mary did when she saw the fox and hares and hedgehogs fleeing across her land, and you'll hear her talk about that. And I don't think there's any honour in doggedly sticking to a particular course if you think it's not right for you anymore. And this message seems to be running through the podcast more and more, but it is okay to be yourself and do what you believe in, even if it's not the popular option or if it goes against what people think they know about you. So be brave, go forth and do what feels right. And I hope you enjoy listening.
So I started off, I went to college to do garden design. Didn't want to go, but my parents, in retrospect, very kindly insisted I went to college, and I fancied a guy doing landscape design. And so that was my big calling. And I went and did that course in UCD in Dublin, which took 4 years. And it turned out I was really good at design, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. And I lost the will to live pretty soon after starting. And I was designing gardens around the Dublin area for a few years. And then I moved back to the countryside in Wicklow County, which is down beneath Dublin. And I lived in the mountains in a little tiny cottage. And I found my connection to nature again, which I'd had when I was a kid, when I grew up in Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. And I kind of realized I didn't want to keep doing what I was doing. So I kind of realized that nature was the real deal and gardens were a very pale imitation of what we kept trying to change to make some kind of an idea of beauty that we had morphed in our minds as being the only ideal. And actually, the only true beauty is natural, nature. And so very obvious to me at the time that there was something seriously wrong the way we were doing this. So I still hadn't really worked it out, but I knew I had to do something different. So I decided to build gardens based on wild places and native plants. But nobody would let me build a garden that was kind of like a bunch of weeds. So I applied to do a garden at the Chelsea Flower Show in London because I hadn't heard of anywhere else. And it occurred to me that maybe if I did a showcase that I could maybe change the way we were working with land in our gardens. So there was a big story behind that, and I went ahead and it happened. It was quite a magical story. And then that kind of changed the fashion as such in garden design. It kind of made wild gardens fashionable. And that sounds kind of like a small thing, but fashion seems to have an influence on culture in many ways, you know. So it brought it into the consciousness of people that actually wildness is valid and that we don't really have to keep fighting against nature all the time. So anyway, that brought me into an international career where I designed gardens like that everywhere. And then a movie was made about that period of my life, and I decided to write a book to go along with that. I wrote myself out of a job, basically, because I realized that although all these gardens I was making were beautiful and they were designed in harmony with the shapes and patterns of nature, and they didn't block the flow of universal energy, and they had a very magical quality to them, the gardens and the land themselves did not want to stay as I had designed them. They wanted to grow and morph and change into something else, and I was still forcing them to stay in a particular shape and size that I had imagined. So I realized that everything I was doing was rubbish, and I sat back and tried to reimagine it again. And so I wrote a book called The Garden Awakening, based on kind of a practical book to help people create gardens that allowed the land to become what it wanted to become, and still getting something for ourselves out of it in the culture that we live in. So that made a lot of sense, and it changed the way I work. And something happened then about a year ago or less. I was sitting at my desk here. I rent a property in Ireland, and I have a lot of land, luckily not a lot, like about 5 acres. So near where I live, which I'm trying to build a house on. It's just taken me a little while. I've been planting up trees and for years, and a big, massive orchard. And I was sitting at my desk looking down over my rented property, half of which I've left to completely go wild. And luckily, my landlord is really kind and understanding, and he gets what I'm at. A fox ran across the lawn in front of me, and then just after him, a couple of hares. So this had my attention because normally it's the other way around. And so I kept looking, and pretty soon there was a little family of hedgehogs that scuttled across the hedge, underneath the hedge along the same path. And they're usually nocturnal animals, so I kind of thought this is like Noah's Ark, you know. So I went outside and went in the direction they were coming from. And at the end of my lane, across the road, was a field which had been a big thicket of life, brambles and hawthorns and blackthorns. It was impenetrable. And somebody had just bought the land, about an acre, to build a house at the top of the land. And they'd gone in and done what everybody does, which is to clear the whole land in an instant with a digger. And all of these creatures that we share the planet with, they had not been given any thought. Everybody thinks they'll live somewhere else, but they have nowhere else to go. They can't go to agricultural land. They're poisoned with chemicals and lack of habitat, and they take refuge in the wild patches that are left, very, very small patches, and our gardens, which we have morphed into something very unnatural and something tidy, which does not support life. So I stood there looking at this in absolute horror and realized I'd done the same thing myself so many times. And at that point, I realized I have to change everything again. So now I'm asking people to give at least half of any land they have, including the patch that their house sits on, give at least half of it back to nature, because we've taken too much and we have to give as much of it as possible back. and to allow it to rewild, because nature knows best what to plant there. We haven't a clue what we're at. Everything she needs is already in the ground. If we expose the earth and allow it to come through, or just leave it alone, depending on each patch of earth is different. Some of them can be left alone. Some of them might need a little bit of reboot for the ecosystem. But all I'm asking is that people put up a sign in their land saying this is an ark, and put the website underneath to explain to people what's happening. And this is an environmental movement, which is a wild growth movement. It's giving people hope, giving them something that they can do to actually impact the crisis that we're living in. And it's spreading like wildfire all over the earth. And there's arcs everywhere now. I only launched it in March, and the hope is that it's not dependent on me. It's a wild growth movement. It's a very, very simple movement. And I'm hoping that if enough of us do this, and you'll hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, that won't make any difference. It's only tiny little bits of garden." But actually, there's quite a lot of farms coming on board. I'm asking county councils, local governments to come on board. I'm asking schools to come on board. And we're creating a map of arcs now. And if we can connect them all up, it'll make a massive patchwork quilt which will wrap its way around the globe. And it will shift the consciousness and change the level of understanding of connection we have and dependence we have on nature by doing absolutely nothing.
As you were talking, I was thinking, I moved out of London down to Sussex, and long story short, I kind of share a property with my family, and we have a tiny little paddock. It's 3/4 of an acre, and my neighbours were grazing it. And I said to my mum, right, okay, that's it. I'm vegan. I don't really support the idea of us having these spring lambs on the paddock, knowing that they're going off to be killed. So can I take the paddock back and do what I want to do with it? So at the moment, the grass is coming through, everything's coming through. It's amazing to watch it. But I know that come autumn, I'm going to be expected to mow it. And it will be treated as a kind of hayfield almost, because if I were to let that land just do its own thing, not only would my mother be absolutely terrified, my neighbours would be horrified. You know, they keep their paddocks, which are adjacent, really closely mown. So how do you deal with that when people are scared of what nature can do? What do you say to them?
Well, the sign gets rid of that, because people are afraid of being shamed. That's what they're afraid of. They're afraid that somebody will look in and say that this is disgraceful, that they're lazy, all those things. It's kind of a sense of belonging to the community. They don't want to be outcast. So if you put a sign in, very, very clearly stating what you're doing, it instantly transforms that into a positive energy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
If you mark your piece of land as an ark, you're suddenly doing something incredibly useful, and therefore you remove that shame, which is the basis of the arguments that your mum would have, even though they may not want to admit it. That's where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But once you explain to them, you know, simple stuff like we're losing 200 species to extinction every single day on the earth, the threads of the web of life are being pulled apart, and we are completely dependent on all these creatures we share the planet with to keep this system well and healthy so that we can continue to survive here. And at some point we'll pull one too many threads, not too far in the future, and the whole thing will collapse. So actually we have to step into a new role as one of guardian on the earth, not gardener, not farmer, guardian of the land. And we can still grow food in different ways. But George Monbiot termed a coin called sheep-wrecked. You know, land is all sheep-wrecked. There's too much sheep. All those highlands need to be rewilded so that we can rebalance the damage we're doing. I think we need to give at least half of the earth back to nature. And the other argument that, you know, the amount we need all this land to grow food, that isn't valid if you grow food in a different way. The way NEP is growing food, NEP, the rewilding safari place in England, or regenerative farming, you know, forest gardens. If we go back to working in harmony with nature and stop growing food like monocultural damaging processes, and stop putting all this land over to grain to feed animals, we have to move over to a plant-based diet, but not in the old way. We have to transform